Thank you very much, Mr. Katungu, for your kind introduction. And indeed, one cannot overemphasize the need or the reason for holding these examination meeting techniques. And what one would want to say as a matter of introduction to our learners is that this is not a substitute for your preparation for the exams. You are expected at this stage to have gone through the syllabus and be ready actually to write the exam anytime soon, as early as 2 days from now and so on. But likely we still have 12 days to go before the examination. And so through this interaction, it may enhance your chances of passing the exam. But I would want to suggest that probably by only up to 10%, the remaining 90% is basically the knowledge that you possess at the moment. And so it's important that if we gaps somewhere, we should obviously try and fill up those gaps by going through the areas that we are doubtful about. Okay, so we'll go through the way we will approach it. We'll go through the slides. There are a number of slides, and I'll try and mind my time so that I give you an opportunity at the end of the presentation for you to ask questions or seek clarifications and even to contribute if you want to assess how much you know on a particular topic, or indeed in any area that may not be covered in this presentation, you are free to ask. And so, as we go through the slides, please take note of any concerns or any questions that you might have, so that we look at the questions towards the end, maybe the last 45 minutes to, up to 45 minutes. We've got 2.5 hours for the presentation. And so, as already introduced, my name is Peterson Mumbuluma. I've been involved with the exams for quite a long time. And I also enjoy, actually, and it's my desire that our students perform not only in exams, but like Mr. Katungu has rightly observed, also in the workplace. And auditing is one of the papers that is practical. In other words, if you don't gain the skills and competencies that are expected of you, even when you go out there in the workplace, you may not be able to perform as expected. And also, we must note that this is the first of 2 papers in the CA program. It's the only of the auditing paper in the diploma program. But for CA, it's the first of 2 with the advanced audit coming at the advisory level. And so the knowledge that you gain here is extremely essential for you to actually be able to pass the advanced paper. And most in the advanced paper, the assumption is that you've acquired the knowledge for most of the topics already. What will differ there is basically the depth of the examination and the requirements in the exam. So you do well to not only focus on the examination, but rather to focus on learning and gaining skills. The exam should just be there to confirm that you have acquired the necessary or the expected skills and do what is expected of you once you qualify. And so, with the terms of reference we are given in the engagement letter between me and the Institute, in terms of covering basically 9 main areas as shared on this particular screen. Question requirements, linking questions with scenarios, understanding assurance engagements, understanding standards, auditing standards, application of audit procedures in interim audit, weak analytical explanations in audit responses, attempting all parts of questions selected, examination time management, and the general examination preparation tips. And you will notice that we've covered all these areas, and over and above that, we've tried to look at the main areas where students have got challenges. So we are trying to give you more than what is in the terms of reference. So please be listening carefully and see where you probably need additional explanations. Right. Right. So let's go to the first slide, which has got the contents of the presentations. I will not really go through each one of these items because this presentation will be shared with you by the Institute. And so you'll be able to see and the contents that are covered in there. But the session objectives, what is the aim of this presentation for CA2.3 and DA11 candidates? There are 4 strategic aims of this interaction examination clinic, namely expert interaction, to give you an opportunity for you to attach a reality to these exams. You are talking to somebody who is involved in the examinations, who has got vast experience in examinations, and so on. So that gives you an opportunity to interact with me and for you to also ask questions or clarifications which you think will help you or will enhance your chances of passing the examination. So it's basically expert interaction with you and the examiners. And then, of course, to highlight the main problems candidates encounter in the major syllabus areas. We hope that by the time we are done, you will give clarity on certain areas based on previous examiners' publications and analysis made by the chief examiners, including the last exam, the March exam, and also to help you with the examination technique that you can use in writing the next exam that you'll be writing. And that that's supposed to increase your chances of passing any of the two papers which you may be asking. And then finally, we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions and contributions that you may wish. So it's quite important that you pay particular attention as we go through. In terms of the syllabus weightings and the examination structure, basically, like Mr. Katungu said, we are talking about two papers here, CA2.3 and DA11. Actually, in terms of content, these two papers have exactly the same content in terms of what you are expected to learn. The only difference is the syllabus weightings. So all the chapters or all the topics in DA11 are covered fully in CA2.3 as well, except the examination structure and the weightings are different. And it's important as candidates to know or to pay attention to these syllabus coverage percentages that we have. And these are contained in your two handbooks, student handbooks. And you will notice if you look at this schedule which I'm sharing now, you've got the purpose and context of audit. In 2.3, that covers 20% of the syllabus. 20% of the syllabus means that 24 marks of the 120 marks in the paper will come from this particular unit. These are units, whereas in the DA11, it's only 5%. The same topics and so on, DA11, 5%, CA2.3, 20%. Corporate governance is 20% of the syllabus in 2.3, culminating to 24 marks. In DA11, it is 10%, culminating to 12.5%. Internal audit is only partially covered in 2.3 in one of the other units, but in DA11, 5% is on internal audit. Risk is 20% in 2.3, 15%, and so on. And in brackets, you will see there the equivalent number of marks per paper that should be, from each of these units. That should help you attach importance to certain topics. For example, if you look at it, 2.3, they are equally weighted. There are 5 units, all of them are 20%. And in the DA11, you can see the internal controls, which is, I think the 5th unit, is 20% of the syllabus, as much as the specific areas of audit. And so those will carry the bulk of the marks. And so you should know which the topics to pay particular attention to. And the idea is, and the thinking is, you are expected to study the whole syllabus. And you want to know from which unit questions will come from. And all the chapters in each unit stand a chance of being selected in terms of examination questions. Quite important indeed. In terms of the structure of the two examination papers, for the CA2.3, it has one compulsory question in section A of 40 marks each, and 4 optional questions, out of which students are expected to choose any 3, which means 60 plus 40 gives you the 100, and the pass mark is 50 marks. The total marks in a paper is 120. Since there is a choice in the optional, you leave out one optional question, then you are marked out of 100, and the pass mark, yes, is 50%. Whereas in the diploma part, 2 compulsory questions, meaning they are required to answer, you are required rather to answer 2 compulsory questions of 25 marks each, and then choose out of 3 optional questions, 2 questions again of 25 marks each. So the total marks in the paper are 125, and the pass mark again is 50 out of 100, since one of the questions will not be attempted. It's important that we know this. And also another important matter that we really need to make sure we know and understand as we prepare, as we start preparing actually for the examinations, is the learning outcomes. This gives you an indication of what is expected of you. And so we should spend time and understand the learning outcomes. And possibly even as we prepare for the examinations, go back and look at the learning outcome and ask yourself, am I able to meet this particular learning outcome? Because if you are not able to, then you will have challenges in the examination. And so starting with the learning outcomes for 2.3, you can see at a glance there that most of the learning outcomes begin with the verb explain, which means you have to have an understanding of whatever principles are in that particular topic. So it's all explain, 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 limited evaluation on internal control, where you're expected to evaluate and comment on whether internal controls are sufficient or they are lacking. Limited evaluation on the quality of evidence that you are supposed to gather as part of the evidence that will form the basis of the opinion. And then apply appropriate procedures to gather evidence. In other words, the audit procedures. There you need to apply that and evaluate the results of the evidence. So you can see the bulk of the questions will be basically requiring you to explain. And if you are required to explain, which means you need to understand what you are actually explaining. Otherwise, we will not be able to manage to answer the examination questions. And that is similar in the DA11 also in terms of the learning outcomes. Most of it you can see is explain principles, explain the nature of internal audit, explain, a bit of identification in 4.2.7 and evaluation in terms of the report in deciding on what form of opinion to issue. So we need to understand these learning outcomes. You cannot start preparing unless you know this is the objective of the whole course, if you wish. You need to be able to do this after studying, after passing these papers and so on. So please, let's from time to time look at the learning outcomes and assess ourselves on whether we meet those outcomes once we finish a particular chapter. Okay. Let's look now at general matters and how to pass the examination. We want to look at the prior knowledge that you require to have as you prepare for this particular paper. We want to look at the study tools that you should have because you need to have the ammunition. You can't just go into studying. You must know what you require to have, the verbs that are used, and then the formula for passing, what can help you enhance your chances of passing. That's what we want to look at. And so in terms of prior knowledge, we said for both papers, actually 2.3 and DA11, this is the first auditing paper in the programs, okay? And so you don't need to have any prior knowledge of auditing in terms of examinations. You might have work experience, which you will see, which is quite a very big advantage, so to say. But even those without work experience, they should be able to navigate through and be able to pass because the material that is available is actually sufficient enough. Okay, and so communication skills are very important, and I cannot overemphasize on this particular matter. This is a theory paper, and communication skills we're talking about are writing skills, being able to communicate correctly so that the markers, the examiners understand what you are saying. It is not really the examiners who start filling in gaps and assume that I think the student here was trying to say this. They will take what you have written the way it is. A bit of carelessness can actually change the meaning of a point, and that can cost you easy marks. So communication skills are very, very important, including the presentation, good handwriting, and everything that goes with communication, addressing the question requirements and so on. It's expected that at this level, you have those skills because in any case, there is, I think in both papers, a paper on communication, which you would have passed. And so it's assumed that you have those skills to be able to communicate effectively. I want to say and challenge you that at the moment, the communication skills exhibited in auditing are very poor. And I'm being very candid to you and telling you things the way they are. And why am I saying so? I have reviewed some examination scripts. I know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking from without or from a theoretical point of view. The communication skills are very poor, and so bear that in mind to try and improve the communication skills. Financial reporting knowledge is essential. It's required for you to pass an auditing paper. And the reason is simple, colleagues. We are auditing financial statements. And you cannot audit something that you do not know, something that you do not understand. And that is why in both programs, actually, the accounting papers come earlier than the auditing paper. Because when we come to auditing, we teach auditing, not financial reporting. And there's a big gap here. So accounting standards govern what management assets. The accounting standards, management prepares accounts according to international financial reporting standards. So you cannot identify an audit risk without knowing what could go wrong. So you need to have a very good knowledge of the relevant international financial reporting standards or international accounting standards. And the good news or the good thing is these are specified in each of the syllabuses. It's not all the accounting standards, but you know you've got guidance. You need to know about IAS 16 on tangible non-current assets. You need to know the provisions of IAS number 2 on inventories. You need to know the guidance on IAS 37 and so on and so on. Quite important indeed. So you assume to have that knowledge. If you don't have that knowledge, I must say, it's not a bad idea to have an accounting manual near you so that you can revise, go through the accounting, so that by the time you're writing the examinations, you will have some knowledge of accounting for those areas that you are required to have that knowledge in the exam. Work experience, we said, is a very important skill also. Wherever you work, just always think about auditing. Use the experience that you have in actually studying this paper and in answering examination questions, because we are talking about the sales system. We're talking about the inventory system. We're talking about purchases and so on. So if you experience these things, we're talking about goods received notes, invoices, and so on. So a person who is in the workplace should find it much easier to navigate through auditing. In terms of accounting standard, again, we need to acquire knowledge on accounting standards, provisions of relevant accounting standards for syllabus, specific syllabus areas, accounting standards like IAS 2, I've already mentioned, IAS 16, 37, and so on. These are directly examinable. And so you find questions relating to those accounting standards. And the evidence that is there is that a lot of students do not understand the accounting, and therefore they fail to actually design or describe suitable audit procedures or even identify audit risks. For example, if you are required to explain the audit risk regarding tangible non-current assets, you can only do that if you know what is required for tangible non-current assets. If you don't, then you cannot describe the audit risk. And in auditing, we will ask you to actually explain the audit risk. So you would need to go around and make sure you answer those. Very, very important. In terms of the essential study resources, basically it's the student's handbook, which you are supposed to have. The student's handbook is a very, very important document. I hope I'm visible. I've got a copy of the student's handbook with me here. This is for the CA program. There is another one for the diploma program. You need to have this. It's a handy tool which you must refer to. That's the one that contains the syllabus and a lot of valuable information which helps you prepare for the examinations. And then, of course, the study manual. I prefer someone having a hard copy of either the 2.3 or the DA11 study manual. Using a soft copy is not the best. I am aware that soft copies are available. It's not very easy to navigate from one page to another using a soft copy. Either, if you were using a soft copy, you would do well to print. So they are hard copies and you're able to go through, underline, and so on, so that you can go through as many times as you can. So preferably a hard copy. And this is the primary study resource. These manuals are self-sufficient. Or you don't need any other material. You can actually pass the exam just by going through the official study material that the Institute has issued. The practice revision kit is essential. A lot of us, there's evidence that most of us do not go through the revision kit. How do I say so? We can tell from the answers that you give in the examination. Because if students went through the revision kit and attempted these questions, then they would obviously perform better than if they didn't. But the evidence that is there is that most of us do not have time to revise, and most of us actually revise or practice in the examination where we're supposed to be writing the actual exam. And so you reduce your chances of passing the exam. Later on, I will tell you, if you went through 3 questions, just reading 3 questions and 3 solutions on a daily basis for the next 10 days, you would have gone through 30 questions in the revision kit. That's almost the whole revision kit. And I'm talking about reading, not actually attempting. You read. If you can jot down your thoughts and compare with the suggested solution. That will help you understand how exam questions come, how you're expected to answer them, and so on. There's no secret. The secret is in going through past examination questions and answers, and those that have been shared by the Institute on the website. past exam papers and answers are available. We must read through those. They are very, very important. And of course, the Accountants Act. We are training to be accountants. Let's not just make reference to these documents. You can print the Accountants Act is available on the internet and so on. So that you go through. You just have to go through. It would be a good idea as a student of accountancy to know what is expected of you at the end of the day. So you do well to go through the Accountants Act. You will learn a lot in terms of ethics and so on, you see. So basically, those are the tools that we should ensure we have. In terms of verbs that are used in the examination, know what is being asked. Because you need to know what is being asked, and that is where the problem is. A lot of us answer questions which are not actually in the question requirements. So the verb is the question in the question determines the depth and form of your answer. The verb that is where it says explain, demonstrate, evaluate, apply, assess, identify, and describe. It's important to you that you know what you are expected when each of these verbs are used. And we saw when we looked at the learning outcomes that most of the verbs here basically require you to explain a little bit of evaluation and application as well. And so when they say explain, what are you supposed to do? That should determine or help you determine how much depth to go in answering the question. So in explaining, they're saying state a principle, a term, idea, or concept clearly to show understanding, more than a list. So explaining is more than just stating. Stating is it's the lowest verb that can be used. But here you have to show an understanding by explaining, not just stating and so on. It requires articulation. You need to know, you have to have the knowledge for you to be able to explain. It says the technique at the bottom there says use the definition and then elaborate. Use the definition and then expand. Don't just leave it hanging like that. Explaining. Demonstrate means show how something works in practice, applied, not theoretical. You are demonstrating that you are able to determine a materiality level in an audit. You are demonstrating, given basic figures, how would you do this? Demonstrate that you're able to do it. Requires worked examples or step-by-step application. Frame your answer as to the auditor would, because action and rationale, it says because action and rationale together are necessary. Okay, evaluate. Evaluate. So you're given something, then you have to evaluate it at a higher level. Assess, and this applies to both papers. Even the demonstrate is basically in DA11. Explain both papers. Evaluate. Assess or judge the quality, effectiveness, or appropriateness of something. You are given something and you're supposed to evaluate. Requires a position and justification. You can't just explain, you need to justify why you think things should go this way. These are the skills we are expected to show in terms of evaluation. Do not simply describe or repeat what is in the question. State your assessment and defend it with evidence or reasoning. You defend it to say, me, I'm saying this because of the following. If your writing is logical, then you'll be able to get whatever marks the examiners might want to give you. Apply is use information or a principle in a specific situation. Apply. Execute, implement, solve, scenario specific, not general. You apply, information is given in the scenario, use that information. General answers will not gain you maximum marks. Reference to specific scenario details, generic answers score far fewer marks than those who actually use the information. And all these skills we can learn by going through past exam questions and answers. And then, of course, finally, assess, identify, and describe. It says we assess, weigh up risks or findings, and determine significance. Identify and describe, locate specific items, and explain them. Identify from the information that you are given. You cannot be asked to identify something that is not in the scenario. So just be skeptical. You'll be able to identify and say, this is what the examiner requires. For identify and describe, always name the specific item first, then explain it. So use the information in the scenario. Specific item, what is happening? Mr. So-and-so is a relative to or is a spouse of the chief accountant, and therefore it creates a self-interest threat and so on. Be specific, not general answers. So it's important that we know the verbs and how they are used. How they are used we can get by looking at past exam questions and answers. How to pass the exam, 4 disciplines from the study manual. 4 disciplines from the study, drawn directly from page 15 of the DA11 study manual. Apply to both papers. These apply to both papers. Study the whole syllabus. I have received calls from students saying, which topics should I concentrate on? Honestly, how would someone tell you which topics to concentrate on? You are given a syllabus. The whole syllabus should be studied. I mean, imagine I always give an example of pilots who fly aircrafts in the air. Imagine if pilots just studied a few things and don't know maybe how to land an aircraft or how to navigate when there's a storm. Then obviously they're a danger to the passengers who they fly around. And so equally, we should study the whole syllabus without exception, because any part of the syllabus is examinable. The only thing one can tell you is basically based on the syllabus weightings and say concentrate on these areas because they're given a higher weighting. The expectation is that when you are done with the studies, you know everything. And the idea is to obviously force you to cover the whole syllabus. Because if it was possible to tell where the exam is going to come from, then people just say, study this, study that, and so on. Then when you qualify those areas that you did not study, it means you haven't gained the skills and competencies. So the idea is study the whole syllabus, okay? Of course, another foundation of how to pass a discipline says lots of question practice. And honestly, if we are to be honest, most of us, be honest with yourself. How many questions have you attempted? There's a revision kit that you can buy or access. There are many questions you can access, even on the internet, if you don't have the Zika revision kit. Because auditing is auditing. You can look for questions from any source, auditing questions, and attempt these questions under exam conditions. That will increase your chances of what? Passing the exam. Practicing in the exam is not the best strategy. It will not work. The practice and revision kit is the best tool to use for this, or indeed the published questions and answers by the Institute. Applying questions, analyzing questions carefully. This is another important point we should take into consideration if we are to pass the examination. The question requirements. It is evident, it is very clear that sometimes students don't understand the question requirements, or they don't apply the question requirements as expected. A question requires you to explain business risks, and then someone explains audit risks. Either they do not understand the difference between business risk and audit risk. Sometimes students will just answer a question more or less like setting their own question. You wonder where the question they're answering came from. So you need to understand first, before you put the pen on paper, understand what does the examiner want. Even as I'm answering, am I answering to satisfy the examiner's requirements? Are we together? So answers must be relevant to the scenario, not general knowledge dumps and so on. Sometimes as students, we just say anything that is auditing. And somehow, for whatever reason, we think we can get marks. It doesn't work like that, colleagues. We must be specific, read the question carefully, understand the question, and then address the question in your answering, okay? And of course, answering questions well judged, clear answers grounded in the scenario will always score marks. Markers have a wide remit to reward good answers. This is theory. The markers will, you see, two candidates can score 56. Both candidates have scored 56. When you look at the answers, they may not be similar, but they are correct. And so markers in a theory paper like this one have got a wide ambit where they can award marks depending on your arguments, depending on your answer. You can all pass the exam. Are we together? The marks on offer tell you how much to write. Very, very important. Sometimes for 2 marks, you write half a page. Waste of time. For 6 marks, you write only 1 sentence. It doesn't work like that. Be guided. Usually, most of the questions actually specify the number of points that you are expected to explain. And therefore, we should actually comply with that and explain those points that have been specified in the examination. The mathematics of passing or scoring strategy. And again, your mind must be focused towards this. 50 marks needed to score well on the compulsory question. And it's true. You do well to score not less than 50 marks and then secure marginal marks from the optional questions. I'll tell you one thing. An analysis of examination scripts, marked examination scripts, has shown that the bulk of the students who pass score more than 50% in the compulsory question because it carries the highest number of marks. And actually, I will tell you that usually it is the easier of the questions the performance in the optional questions is very bad. And this you can confirm. Go and read the examiner's report for this paper for March, which clearly explains. And if you look at the average scores in the optional questions, they are well below 10 out of 20. Are you together? Not because the exam is difficult, but because the compulsory question is largely scenario, and most of the questions, like we have already said, the answers are in the scenario. So you're able to identify and quickly gain those marks that you need to gain in the compulsory question within the time that is allowed, which is 72 minutes for CA2.3 and 45 minutes for DA11. So you get more than 50 there if you can. You can get 50% wrong, actually. It's out of 100. So be aware that actually you can get 50 wrong and still pass the exam. So you are only expected to know half what is expected, which I think is fair. Okay. The pass rates, look at the pass rates for March 2026 and March for DA11 and 2.3. Disappointing. The 2.3 pass rate was 28.6%, meaning out of 100 students who attempted this paper, only 28 passed. Only 28, the others failed. And the DA11, I think there were 96 students. Out of those 96, only 16.7 passed the exam. The rest failed. And that's why of all the papers, a few papers have been selected to go through these exam techniques. So that will help you enhance your chances of passing the exam. Are we together, colleagues? And we can see here what is happening and what I'm demonstrating at the bottom of this slide. We're saying theoretically, you should get 50% in each question. 50% in the compulsory gives you 20 marks. And 50% in each of the optional for 2.3 gives you 10. When you add the 20 plus the 30 gives you the 50 which you require to pass. Equally, in the DA11, for you to pass the exam, to enhance your chances of passing the exam, you must get a minimum of 50% in each of the 4 questions that you attempt. You must get 50%, and that will give you the 50 marks out of 100, which means you would have passed the exam. But in practice, we know that it is not always the case. Most students will score maybe in case of 2.3, they will score 27 out of 40 marks, which is quite good. And then that compensates for the poor performance in the optional questions. And I'm not saying we should aim for a poor performance in the optional questions, but that is the evidence that is there. Right? And it's because the optional questions largely contain questions which require you to know accounting standards, auditing standards, and so on, audit procedures. And students appear to have challenges in answering those questions. So you must have a strategy. You must have an aim. And so even as I'm going on that Thursday to write my exam, I will aim at getting not less than 25 maybe in the compulsory question in the case of CA2.3, and maybe 19 in the case of DA11. And move on like that, minding your time, of course. Very, very important. It says the strategy should be score well on the compulsory questions to compensate for optional losses, to compensate for any losses that you might have. Marginal marks from every question are non-negotiable. You need any mark. Don't give up in the exam. Fight to the bitter end. You even need the 2 full marks that you can get in a last question. That will make a difference between passing. 4 marks from 50 will give you 46. 46, you have failed the exam. So we should really aim at scoring maximum marks and ensuring that we get all the marks that we possibly can. Let's quickly look at an analysis of the March 2026 examination results. And this would be quite beneficial, and I thought we should discuss this, particularly for the majority who may be attending this meeting, who actually sat for this paper in March. Because there are students like that, looking at the pass rate, it means most of the students may actually be repeating this particular paper and want to see what the numbers reveal and what must change in order to improve these pass percentages. I want to emphasize again, the Institute gets concerned about the poor performance. It's a fact. Otherwise, they would not spend money organizing these meetings. The marking teams get concerned. What can you do? And we're getting the point. They get concerned on the poor performance. So it's not like anyone has certain numbers that students must pass. No. If all students meet the syllabus requirements, then they will pass. This is nothing like, no, there are too many and so on. Let's get that very, very clear. It says both papers below expected pass rates and dangerously low average scores. You look at the average scores. This is analytical procedures which we teach in auditing. You should be able to make information out of, get information out of these statistics through analyzing these numbers. Look at the total number of candidates who sat for 2.3, were 175, only 50 passed. The 125 failed the exam, 2.3, and the pass rate was 28.6. I think it was a little lower in December. Okay, the overall average score. What do we mean by the overall average score? Meaning, when you add all the scores by the 175 students, 75 and divide by 175, on average, students were getting 39.6. Are you getting the point? So 39.6 is far below 50. So which means the majority of the students were on the lower end or on the lower side. And the average score of those who passed, the 50 who passed, you can imagine the average score there also was only 55%. 55, but they've passed. 50, 51, 52, 53, average of 55. Okay? Then the average score of those who failed. Now that means a lot, 31.7%. Those who failed the exam, the average score was 31.7%, which is rather too low. And this suggests that actually these students just did not know. They did not understand, they could not explain, they could not apply, and so on. Otherwise, the average score would have been much higher than that. The number of students who attempted less than the required number of questions, in 2.3, there are only 9, fortunately, not very bad. 9 students attempted less than the required number, and so on. Now we are together. And only 1 out of these 9 passed this exam. What am I trying to communicate? If you don't attempt the 4 questions, believe me, the way we used to study ourselves, if I attempt only 3, then immediately after the exam, I start studying for the next exam. Because my chances of passing are very minimal. Only 1 out of the 9 passed the exam. Look at DA11, 96 students, only 16 passed, which means my mathematics tells me what, 16, 80 students failed. 8 out of the 96, pass rate of 16.7, quite low. And the average score is 34%, again signifying poor understanding of the subject, which means students have not acquired the necessary skills and competencies. And the average of those who passed is 54%. Look at the average of those who failed the exam, 30.1%. And 4 attempted less than the required number of questions, and none of these 4 passed the exam. I'm trying to communicate so that you know, and you prepare yourself such that you are saying, I will attempt all the questions, and so on. Now together. And if I showed you, I missed out the average scores of these students who failed the exam. The average scores are very low, signifying that time is not a factor. Because if you attempt 3 questions in 3 hours, then you should do very well in these 3 questions. Or you attempt 2 questions in 3 hours. If you let's assume time is a factor, then you should score highly in these 2 questions. But the average scores were about 30 or below 30% in both papers, communicating something that actually there's lack of understanding and knowledge. Let's look at the main observations from the March 2026 examination, and 8 specific failure patterns identified from the examiner's analysis of the scripts. Meaning we have looked at these scripts, your answers, your booklets, and a few important things were obtained or learned from that analysis. Not addressing the question requirement. I've already mentioned that candidates explaining topics correctly, but not addressing the actual requirement. Sometimes candidates give answers that are not related. Are we together? And therefore, since we are not answering the question, no marks are awarded for doing that. Are we together? Technically correct content for the wrong question. So we are explaining what audit risks are correctly, but the question required you to explain the business risks. So even if the examiner knows that these are correct answers for audit risks, they won't award you marks because you're not answering the question. If the question is, what is your name? Just give your name. If you give where you live, then that is wrong. That's how simple it is. Are we together, colleagues? Okay. Too few points, giving fewer points than required where a number is specified or where not specified, candidates must use the marks on offer to determine how many valid points are needed. Usually, most of the questions will tell you, explain 4 audit procedures, describe this, and you are able to tell. Sometimes they will not, they'll just give you a question without explaining how many marks for each part. If they say distinguish audits from reviews, and it's 4 marks, distinguish audits from reviews, then you can assume, you can say, look, for explaining reviews, I'll get 2 marks. For explaining audits, I'll get 2 marks, hence the 4 marks. We should be guided by the number of marks on offer to decide how many valid points we should give. Unattempted question parts. This is a very serious one. A very serious one, and I want to emphasize, a significant number of candidates left parts of questions unanswered with unallocated marks accumulated to the equivalent of a full optional question, meaning you don't answer question 1B1, you don't answer it. Question 1, 2, C, part 3, you don't answer it, nothing. You just indicate that you have seen that is a question requirement. And at the end of the day, you find that marks accumulating up even up to 20 marks, which is the equivalent of an optional question, have not been attempted. So technically, you are being marked out of 80 to get 50% out of 80 rather than 100. And the reason for not attempting parts of questions, it means, again, students don't have the knowledge. But you can use an intelligent guess. There are no marks deducted for attempting to answer a question. You can use an intelligent guess as long as you've gone through the syllabus. There's always something you can say, and say it. Are we together, colleagues? The only people who benefit from not answering parts of questions is the markers, because there's nothing to mark. Are you getting the point? There's nothing to read. So you just cross and so on and move on. It's much faster to mark a script that has very few answers than to mark one which has got a lot of answers. So an attempted question part. Then poor handwriting and presentation. Some handwritings, I should have brought a magnifying glass. In our team, we have a magnifying glass. Sometimes we just have to check what is the student trying to say here. That's how far the examiners try to go. Some handwritings you just cannot read. And if you can't read, you can't award marks. It's simple as all that. If you are the only one who can read, unfortunately, you're not the one who is marking. So your handwriting must be legible so that anyone can read and understand. Are we together? Presentation of answers must be good also. Writing in examiners' margins. I hope you know what I'm talking about. I wish I'd brought with me an answer sheet where you write in the margins, honestly. Clearly it's stated margins are reserved for the examiners. And for some reason, and the only reason, is a good number of students write in those margins. What is supposed to be in those margins are your marks. Now tell me, if you write on the whole thing, where will the marks be put? If you put marks where they are you are overwriting on what is already written, it's possible that marks can be left out when adding. So let's just follow clear instructions. The moment I see a script where a student writes everywhere, immediately the mind says this student probably, what else could go wrong here? They can't even follow simple instructions. Please, answers written there risk being omitted entirely from collection and marking, meaning the marks that are supposed to be put in that margin may be left out when adding the marks and so on. Are we together? New question, same page. I think it's the answer script which says start a new question on a different page. And the Zika has got hundreds and thousands of answer booklets, and you are allowed to get even 2, 3, 4 booklets if you so wish. But of course, you must use them economically. And a significant number, particularly in March, for all papers, 2.3&DA11 and 3.2. A significant number of students will answer a question. When they end another question, then immediately below that, they start another question, contrary to the provision or to the instructions that have been given. That can confuse the markers. They may mark you wrong, thinking this is an answer to this question which they've indicated there. The markers take great care, but there's a risk. There's always a risk, like we teach in auditing. You can't guarantee. So there's a risk that actually you may lose marks, and also you're just not following instructions. And in numbered solutions, quite common, or wrong numbering. Wrong numbering. You're answering, especially when you change, you decide to answer question 2, suddenly you have changed, you want to answer question 3. You don't change that I'm answering question 3, you go on and answer, and the reference is question 2. Very risky. Very risky. Most likely the markers will be able to see that this solution does not match the question referred to. And so please, let's make sure we number our solutions clearly and correctly. Clearly and correct. That's the worst thing you can ever do if the marker cannot identify what you are answering, to their frustration, actually. Are together? Incorrect question marking, like we have already said. You are answering question 2, but the heading there is saying question 3, and so on. Candidates marking attempted questions in the wrong box. You know the front of the answer booklet. It has got 2 sets of boxes. On top, it says indicate or tick the questions that you have attempted. At the bottom, it says for examiner's use. That's where the marks are put, colleagues. Your marks are put at the bottom. For some reason, some students think, no, why? They start ticking where the marks are supposed to go. That already gives an impression that now this student, surely, what other wrong things are in here? You start marking here. Others don't even mark which questions they've answered. They just decide not to do that. And yet the instructions are very clear. And we are telling you now in advance. So what one would expect is that if there are a lot of students in June, in two weeks' time, in 12 days' time, these errors will not be committed again. Are we together, colleagues? Very, very important. Okay, right. Let's look at assurance engagements now. Let's look generally at assurance engagement elements and stages, basically to give you an overview of auditing. So that if you have any doubts, at least you learn something from this presentation. And these engagements, the assurance engagements, are the foundational framework that underpins auditing. This information or this knowledge, you require it because everything surrounds what is studied here in the first chapter of each of the subjects. Okay, assurance engagement and the CREST framework, the elements of an assurance engagement. This is the foundation of the entire subject, the elements of an assurance engagement. What is auditing, in other words? Basically, this involves one party giving assurance to the other. The issue, colleagues, is about financial statements. Financial statements prepared by management. Financial statements prepared by management and the shareholders who don't take part in the day-to-day running of the company. The only link that is there between the company and the shareholders is the financial statements that are prepared. But the question is, how do the shareholders know that the financial statements can be relied upon? We know significant cases of fraud, which may include fraudulent financial reporting. So the shareholders require assurance that the financial statements have been prepared according to the applicable financial reporting framework and they show a true and fair view. That's why an audit is necessary. It's for those people who are not part of the company, who invested money in the company, they've bought shares in the company or they own shares in the company and they are not involved in the day-to-day running of the company. The management are basically stewards. They are acting on behalf of the shareholders. They should not do anything that conflicts their interests. So the shareholders require assurance, hence the audits that we study and learn about. And so the elements of an audit, of an assurance engagement, are 5 elements using the mnemonic CREST chicken. C is the criteria. Or maybe let me start it this way. The subject matter, which is the S there, is the financial statements. That is what is subject to audits. The financial statements prepared by management. Now, what about these financial statements? That they've been prepared in accordance with a given criteria. And hence, the C, criteria. The criteria in this case will be the International Financial Reporting Standards and International Accounting Standards or any other regulations that may govern the preparation of the financial statements in that country. So the financial statements, auditors want to check that these financial statements prepared, which is the subject matter, have been prepared according to this criteria. Are we together? And then the evidence is this other element of the financial, the assurance engagement, where the auditors now come and perform audit procedures, which is a way of gathering evidence, which will form the basis of the opinion. You cannot issue an opinion unless you have gathered the evidence that you so desire, considering the criteria and so on. Are we together? So E is the evidence. And then the R is basically the report. After gathering the evidence, the auditors will evaluate. And based on their professional skills and competencies, using their professional judgment, they will come up with an opinion, which they will communicate to the shareholders through the auditor's report. And this is a 3-party relationship. The T is for the 3-party relationship. Who are these 3 parties? The assurance provider, who is the auditor, the shareholders, and the responsible party, which is management. Are we together? So let's have an understanding of what is happening. It's important that we do so because everything else we learn hinges around this relationship of an assurance engagement. Very, very important. It's separation of ownership and management. Shareholders cannot directly monitor management. Stewardship and agency management should act in the interest of the shareholders. Lack of independence by management may act in their own interest. They want big cars. They could even steal money and so on. So they lack independence because they have an interest and the need for assurance by independent evaluation. Hence, the emphasis on auditor independence. Because if the auditors are not independent colleagues, they will not give the appropriate assurance that is expected in an audit. Quite important. Okay. The 9 foundational concepts basically is the need for assurance, which we have already explained, the separation of ownership and management. Usually, where ownership and management are vested in the same people, there's not much of a problem because the owner is there all the time to manage the business. He makes all the decisions. When he's not there, they lock and no one else is able to access the premises. If they lose anything, it's only them who lose. But as the business grows, then there are other stakeholders who are interested in the success of that company. And as the business grows, you can only be in one place at a time. Think about Dangote. Let's give an example. Think of Dangote, Africa's richest person. Dangote has got businesses in Zambia. I think Dangote has not been to Zambia, if my memory serves me right. But he has got management here. How does Dangote know that the management of Dangote are running the company correctly? Dangote has got businesses in many other countries, and he's only one human being who can only be in one place at a time. And therefore, he entrusts the running of these organizations into management, who are then required to prepare financial statements, which should be audited. So that when Mr. Dangote looks at the audit reports, he says, yes, okay, I can realize things are okay in Zambia. Or investors can make better decisions by reviewing or evaluating what is in the financial statement. So there's usually, as businesses grow, a separation between management and ownership, necessitating an audit. Accountability, stewardship, and agency, we've already talked about that, whereby the management are accountable for their actions. For whatever they do, they are accountable to the owners of the company. They are stewards, and the stewards should not benefit from the relationship that they hold with the principal and so on. They are agents. Are we together? So management are basically agents who should act in the best interest of the owners, okay? And then, of course, corporate governance comes in there, how the organization is managed and controlled. Are we together? Very, very important. Does it have a board of directors? Who comprises the board? What is the composition of the board? Are there committees in the board and so on? Quite important also. And then board and board committees, we have already talked about the audit committee, the risk committee, the remuneration committee, largely comprising non-executive directors, those who are not involved in running the company. Very, very important, colleagues, these issues. Yesterday, I had a meeting, I will not mention where, but I had an audit committee meeting, which I sat in, and there were issues surrounding board and board committees. We established that in this company, big company, I must say, the board of directors comprises the owners of the company. They are also the employees. They are the ones who are running their management, and also they are in the board of directors, which is a very poor corporate governance and so on, you see. And we should be able to talk about such things because the board is supposed to have independent people, and we discussed at length and said, no, we need to correct this, otherwise the company will not really perform. Are we together? It's very, very important in terms of the corporate governance and the company success. Objective of the statutory auditor. What is the aim of the auditor? Again, we need to make sure we know this throughout our studies. The objective or the aim of the auditor is to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence which will enable the auditors form an opinion. Basically, that's it. Whatever they do, all the things, attending inventory count, performing audit procedures, evaluating uncorrected misstatements, all that is aimed at gathering sufficient evidence so that at the end of the day, the auditors can form an opinion, which may either be modified or unmodified. But their opinion will be based on evidence that they would have gathered. Okay, appointment ethics and ethics. Appointment and ethics is another key issue in terms of auditing. The first appointment involves ethical considerations, and preconditions must be met when you are being appointed as auditors. Do you have the skills and competencies to do the audit? Are there any ethical barriers that may cause you not to accept? And because we are supposed to follow fundamental principles, if there are any ethical barriers, for example, which we cannot do anything about, then we should not accept appointment. Are we together? And obviously, on ongoing audits, where you have been auditors for a long time, maybe for 2-3 years, you have to evaluate annually if there are any issues to do with integrity, any issues to do with ethics that may cause you to resign from being auditors. Because if you are not independent, if there are any ethical dilemmas and you continue doing the audit, you may issue an inappropriate opinion which can subject you to litigation. Users may sue you in a court of law, and auditors do not want that. Okay, professional ethics are very important, not only for auditors, but for accountants, particularly in our country, in Zambia. What are professional ethics? We know them, and we're going to talk about them, the IPOC principle and the 5 categories of threats that can cause the auditor or the accountant not to comply with ethical principles. They underpin our profession. These are given, there are 5, we must know them. Okay, then internal audit and reliance is another issue in terms of auditing, where a company has got an internal audit department. The external auditors may want to rely on internal audit by either relying on the work of internal audit or direct assistance of internal audit. And we'll go through the main stages of an assurance engagement. There are 7 sequential stages as follows. The appointment. Auditors have to be appointed, and they're not appointed anyhow. There are procedures to follow, which we must follow. And as an auditor, you must know these procedures when you are being appointed. As a student, you must be able to identify where the procedures have not been followed in an examination question, or indeed just explain what the procedures are, depending on what the examiner would want you to do. So the appointment, you have to consider the preconditions to an audit. Is the financial reporting framework appropriate? Is the integrity of management acceptable? Are there any ethical dilemmas? Has management acknowledged its responsibilities for preparation of the financial statements? So the preconditions must exist. If the preconditions are not existing, colleagues, then don't accept appointment. If it is a continuing audit and the preconditions no longer apply, you might consider resigning from the engagement. Okay, so once we have been appointed, then we plan the audit and perform risk assessment. We plan. Planning is done in the early stages of an audit, and that involves gaining an understanding of the entity and its environment, and being able to identify the risk of material misstatements, what can cause the financial statements to be misstated. And in planning, we develop the audit strategy and the detailed audit plan on how we are going to conduct the audit, obviously considering the audit team. And I assume we know the composition of an audit team. For those who may not know, a typical audit team comprises the following: the engagement partner at the top, who is the head, he's the one who actually forms the opinion, the audit manager below the engagement partner, the audit senior, and the audit assistants. Depending on the size of the audit, maybe 1, maybe 3 audit assistants. That's the audit team. And therefore, the audit team must make sure that they identify the risks that exist. Are we together? Performing the audit involves obtaining sufficient, appropriate evidence. Sufficient in terms of quantity. You cannot conclude by just testing a few items. Of course, we know what determines the number of items to be tested will be the risk and the materiality levels that we will come up with or set. Quite important. We need to know how internal controls can be used in an audit. Internal controls are management's responsibility, and so auditors may test internal controls. And based on the results of the internal controls, they will make a decision whether to follow a combined approach where they place reliance on the internal controls or follow a substantive approach. A question came, I think, in one of these 2 papers, explain the effect of the results of tests of controls on an audit. Now, if you don't know what the tests of controls are, then it means you can't even answer that question. So we need to know what tests of controls, basically, to test whether the controls are operating or not, and then there will be results. Depending on the results, the auditors will make a decision whether to rely on the internal controls and reduce the extent of further procedures, or whether not to rely on the internal controls and do more substantive procedures, whose aim is basically to detect material misstatements. That's the difference. Tests of control aimed at testing on the effectiveness of controls. Substantive procedures, you want to test whether the figures in the financial statements are misstated, and they fall into 2 categories, namely analytical procedures and the tests of detail. So once you've obtained the evidence, you've done the audit procedures, the next stage is reviewing and finalization. The audit now is coming towards the end. You reviewing of the working papers, and also there are specific issues that must be done at the review stage. We must know that, and we are talking about subsequent events, for example, going concern, uncorrected misstatements, and so on. These are done at the review stage of the audit. Are we together? Very, very important. Okay. let's move on, okay? Then reporting is the final stage of the audit, whereby the auditors need to report and issue an opinion in terms of what work has been done. Quite important. Okay, colleagues, let's move on. Now, just a second, technical issue. Sorry about that, colleagues. I could not go to the next slide, so I needed technical assistance. So substantive procedures are aimed at obtaining evidence on whether the figures are materially misstated or not. Review and finalization, this is towards the end of the audit, where the auditors perform certain procedures, such as those related to subsequent events, going concern, and corrected misstatements, and so on. Reporting is the art of now preparing the audit report, which contains the audit opinion. So let's know these main stages of an audit. Okay, right. Where are we? Okay. Yes, the next slide is on appointment, planning, and audit evidence. Like we said, auditors don't just accept appointments, there are procedures to be followed, and we need these. And in that respect, we should be aware of what is meant by preconditions that must exist, which means if these conditions do not exist, then the auditors should not accept appointment. Then we must know the provisions on continuous, which are given in the quality control standards in terms of what firms should do when they've been appointed auditors, maybe for 3 years. Annually, they are required to decide whether or not to continue. Then, of course, the engagement letter and the procedures for resigning, where auditors are resigned, or even the removal of auditors as well. So first appointment, consider integrity of management. When being appointed auditors for the first time, we need to consider the integrity of management and, of course, whether the preconditions for an audit are available or are existing, and also whether the audit firm has got the resources necessary to conduct the audit in both, meaning human resources and financial resources, and whether they've got the competencies. And also, ultimately, before accepting appointment, remember, we are supposed to seek professional clearance from the outgoing auditors, where we write the outgoing auditors to find out whether there are any reasons why we cannot accept appointment. So ethical considerations apply at this stage as well. If there are ethical dilemmas which we can't do anything about, then we should not accept appointment. Continuous, I've already talked about it, where we have to assess annually relationship with a client. And if there are any ethical reasons that have arisen since first appointment, then we should not continue. We may want to resign from the engagement, okay, which is declining or resigning. We must know when to use these terms. You can only decline when you are being appointed for the first time. You can resign when you are already auditors and there are ethical issues of concern that cause you to resign. Okay, let's be aware of the bidding for audit services. Bidding for audit services. Most clients advertise for the offer of audit services so that any interested audit firms can actually apply and submit bids and then be considered whether they should be appointed auditors or not. And so it's from these bids that are put in by clients that audit firms will then respond. We must know what matters we'll consider on whether we want to actually submit a bid in the first place, and also the matters to consider to include in the bid documents. What information should we include as we try to sell our services to the client? And before accepting nomination, seek professional clearance, we are saying. In other words, when a company decides to nominate us or nominate you as the auditors, before you accept, you are supposed to seek professional clearance. Okay, obviously consider whether the preconditions for an audit exist and assess management's integrity, and then communicate request management to allow you to communicate with outgoing auditors. And if that communication is denied, then obviously don't accept. If the management declines to give you permission to communicate, then you don't accept. Removal of auditors, there are specific procedures that must be followed in terms of removal of auditors. And so in the exam, you could be given a situation where the removal was not done per procedure. You should be able to explain and say, look, the procedure was not followed, and what should have been followed is this. Equally, when auditors are resigning, there is notice to be given, there are procedures to be followed. We should be able to explain that. Remember, the verbs that we saw in the learning outcomes requires to explain. Then once you have accepted the appointment, then the next thing that follows is for the auditor to prepare an engagement letter, which contains the terms of the engagement between the auditor and the client, and specifically specifies certain matters, including the responsibilities of management and the responsibilities of the auditors. So we should be able to explain in an exam what the contents of an engagement letter is. We should be able to explain in an exam when there would be need to change the terms or the conditions in an engagement letter. And these, again, should be specific. You are given a scenario, and the examiner may put reasons for changing the engagement letter. You should be able to say, because of this reason, because there's new management, then we may wish to revise the terms of the engagement letter. Otherwise, ordinarily, engagement letters would last for more than 1 year or for more than one accounting period. Let's quickly look at planning the audit. And this involves a number of auditing standards, namely ISA 315 on risk assessment, ISA 330 on the responses on the risk assessed, on the risks identified. Then, of course, ISA 240 on fraud, ISA 250 on laws and regulations, and ISA 230 on documentation. So planning is important, and at the planning stage, we are talking about what is contained in ISA 315. The audit team needs to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. Why? Because first of all, auditors are required to use a risk-based approach to audits, because we don't audit all the items. So we identify the risks that exist that can cause the financial statements to be misstated, and then we respond to those risks. How do we gain an understanding? Through inquiry. We can inquire from management so that we know about the entity, through analytical procedures or ratio analysis, through observations that we may make, through inspection, through the website that may exist, and so on. Okay? And we should know what it is that we need to gain an understanding of. Almost anything, the IT, the information technology system, the controls that exist, we need to gain an understanding of those. The purpose is so that we exert our audit effort to the risk areas where things are likely to go wrong. Quite important, risk assessment. Okay, the distinction between audit risk and business risk. It has been observed in the recent past that students sometimes do not know the difference between audit risk and business risk, particularly where a scenario will contain both business risks and audit risks. And then students struggle to know which one is which. The easiest way to identify an audit risk is what you should be able to explain the impact that risk has on a figure in the financial statements. Business risks are those risks which can cause a business to fail to meet its objectives. They are basically from the point of view of management. Altogether, management are required or expected to assess the risks that may cause the company not to achieve its objectives. Are we together, colleagues? And those are business risks. And then audit risks are those that can cause the financial statements to be misstated. And so in differentiating, it's the explanation that matters, because the same business risk can also be an audit risk, depending on the explanation. Together. If there's anything, let's say a company does not have the raw materials that it requires to be able to run and operate, that's a business risk, because it may not meet customer orders and so on. But then the lack of materials, depending on the extent, could also impact the basis of preparing the financial statements. So that's an audit risk, which can impact the basis on which the financial statements are prepared. Because if the company is not a going concern as a result of not having raw materials, then the financial statements should be prepared on the breakup basis rather than the going concern basis. Very important to distinguish between these. And when you're asked to explain business risks, let it be business risks. If it's audit risks, let it be audit risks. Okay, fraud laws and regulations. Fraud is an important concept. There's a standard there, ISA 240. Management and the auditor responsibilities for fraud, we must know. The auditors are not responsible for fraud. It is management who are running the company. And so they are the ones who should put in place internal controls to help prevent and detect any fraud. Equally, the laws and regulations that apply to an entity, it is management's responsibility to ensure that they put enough controls and comply with any relevant laws and regulations. The auditors will obviously be skeptical and look out for any non-compliance with laws and regulations because they could have an impact on the financial statements. They could result in penalties being charged, and therefore provisions may be understated. Are we together? So the responsibilities for fraud and laws and regulations primarily lies with management. Are we together? Then the auditors will come up with the audit strategy, which is basically a broad outline of how the audit is going to be performed, whether they will have an interim audit and what the objectives are, and so on. Then later on, they will develop an audit plan, which goes into detail in terms of the actual procedures that will be undertaken, who is going to carry out those procedures, and so on. Now, together, and we need, or we are expected to know the contents of each of the audit strategy and the audit plan. Are we together? Audit documentation basically is an important aspect as well. All audit work must be documented. You must show evidence that you performed the audit. In any case, auditors can be inspected by the regulator. For example, Zika can go to an audit firm and request to review the audit working papers for a particular assignment. And therefore, there must be documentation, sufficient documentation. And there are basically two types of documents, the permanent file and the current file. The permanent file carries information that may be relevant for more than one accounting period, okay? While the current file basically contains the evidence that has been gathered in the current year, and it's the basis of the auditor's opinion. Very, very important. Internal controls in planning, we've already talked about internal controls. They are quite important in planning audits, okay? Auditors can save time by reducing the amount of work if they rely on the internal controls, but then they must test the controls to assess whether or not they are operating as expected. If they are not operating as expected, then the auditors will not rely on the controls. They will follow a substantive audit approach where they do more substantive procedures than they would otherwise have done if they had relied on the internal controls. Quite important. Gathering sufficient appropriate audit evidence. These are two terms, two different terms. Sufficient in terms of quantity, appropriate in terms of quality. The basis for every audit opinion is the evidence that has been obtained. So the question is what, how, and to what standard should the documentation be? Generally speaking, the evidence that is gathered should be such that an auditor, a qualified auditor who was not on the assignment, should arrive or should reach the same conclusion as if they were on the what? On the assignment. So the evidence forms the basis for the auditor's opinion. So enough of it should be obtained and it must be relevant. Are you together? And in gathering evidence, assertions must be considered. The auditors must consider the financial statement assertions contained in those figures. And we need to know what these assertions are, including existence, completeness, and so on. Then, of course, test of control versus substantive procedures. We must know the difference between the two and the purpose or the result of tests of control in terms of the substantive procedures. Directional testing, we must know which direction from the accounting records or from outside the accounting records. For completeness, you cannot obtain your samples from within the accounting records, but from outside. Sampling is the art of not testing 100% of the population. Auditors test only samples and conclude on the whole population based on the sample results. We need to know how that is, and also the use of computer-assisted audit techniques. Let me just drink water. Give me a second. Right, thank you. So audit evidence is specific areas. Okay, so you have to know the audit evidence generally, what audit evidence is supposed to be gathered. Then we should know how to gather audit evidence for specific areas. And these are the ones I was saying in the introduction, that the syllabus specifies areas where we need to know the accounting, particularly tangible non-current assets and the provisions of IAS 16. Inventory and inventory count, according to IAS 2. Receivables and sales, the relationship between receivables and sales, cash and bank, provisions, accruals, and contingencies, IAS 37 and IAS 38, and capital and directors' emoluments. We must know the accounting for all these as we gather evidence, because as auditors, we are required, we are expected to gather evidence on all areas of the financial statements, on all material areas of the financial statements. All material balances must have work done on them. Are we together? Right. Says why both sets of standards matter. In other words, the accounting standards and the auditing standards. We must know the distinction between accounting standards and auditing standards. Accounting standards are for use by the preparers of financial statements. Accountants are guided on how they should prepare the financial statements. And so the assertion that accountants make when preparing financial statements is that they would have prepared the accounts according to those standards. And so the auditors will need to obtain evidence that the accounting standards have been followed. So in deciding on the audit procedures to perform, the auditors will have in mind what assertions are being tested. What is management claiming? If it is an accounting standard like IAS 10 on subsequent events, management are making a claim that actually they've accounted for subsequent events correctly, depending on whether they are adjusting or non-adjusting events. Auditing standards are issued for use by auditors. It makes the work of auditors much easier in that the profession has come up with standards. If you're auditing a particular area, if it's subsequent events, you have to follow the guidance given in ASA 560. Are we together? And so, in terms of standards and the examinations, candidates are required to answer examination questions in accordance with the provisions of the auditing standards, because they are the ones that tell us what to do. And so, in answering questions, as a barest minimum, if you can't remember the standard number, but at least the provisions of the standard you need to remember. Generic answers without standard references sometimes do not score very well. Are we together? So if you can't remember the number, at least say as required by the relevant auditing standard, that would be appropriate without necessarily naming the standard. Sometimes students quote wrong standards and say the correct matters. Maybe the examiners will wink, but ideally we should be able to answer correctly according to the auditing standards. So in terms of references to standards in the exam, the examination questions regularly make direct reference to auditing standards. They will mention ISAF 240, ISA 250. Now, if you don't know them, then there is a problem. Are we together? So that stresses the need to learn both the number and the substance, because you may avoid mentioning a standard in your answer, but if it is the one that is stated in the question, then you may be stuck unless you know what it means. So there are some important standards that at least we need to really be able to explain about. Quickly, let's look at reviews and reporting. So having obtained sufficient appropriate evidence, then the audit is coming towards the end. And now there is need for review, and there are specific tasks that are done. Obviously, during the course of obtaining evidence, during the substantive audit stage, reviews would have been conducted by various levels of staff on the audit work that has been carried out. The audit seniors will review the work of the audit assistants just as much as the audit manager will review the work of the audit senior and the assistants. It's an ongoing process, so to say. But then there are specific issues that must be carried out at the review stage. Subsequent events, for example, going concern, and a complete audit reporting framework. Are we together? Okay. The final stage of the audit, and there are 5 critical matters that must be considered here at the review stage. Are we together? So the audit, the gathering of evidence has been done and completed. And so in the review stage, we consider subsequent events. You need to know what the accounting standard says, and the accounting standard is for use by management. And so it's clear it guides management on how to deal with adjusting and non-adjusting events. Are we together? On how to deal with adjusting and non-adjusting events. And we should know we should be able to explain what is meant by an adjusting event, what is meant by a non-adjusting event. Sometimes students show lack of understanding on the difference between the two. Adjusting events are basically events that take place after the period end, before the audit report is signed, but which show evidence of conditions that existed at the period end and hence need to require that the figures be adjusted, because the accounts cannot be concluded until the audit is over. So the audit may go 2-3 months in the subsequent period. So if there are any events that take place from the date of the new accounting period to the date of signing the report, management should look at those events and see if they qualify to be adjusting or non-adjusting events and account for them correctly. The audit risk is that management may incorrectly account for adjusting a non-adjusting event. There's a possibility that management may do the wrong thing. And so the auditing standard gives guidance on the auditor's responsibility with regards adjusting and non-adjusting events. And so the auditor has got an active duty, has got a responsibility to look for adjusting and non-adjusting events taking place between the year end and the date of signing the report. When they establish those adjusting events, they will inquire from management how they were accounted for, to just confirm that they were accounted for correctly or not. If they are not correctly accounted for, request management to correct and correctly account for those. Are we together? So it's important in an exam question, particularly that deals with reporting, to look at dates. There are some important dates. There's a date of when the financial statements are approved by the board, date of the auditor's report. Okay. In fact, the events move like this. From the year end, then the period between the year end and the date of signing the report, the next event is finalization of the audit, and then the audit report will be signed. Once the audit report is signed and the financial statements bound, the next event that will take place is the issue of the financial statements. And that term is important. Issue simply means the financial statements will be posted now to the shareholders. From issuing the financial statements, the next stage is the annual general meeting at which the financial statements will be considered. So let's make sure we know, and when we read the questions, let's make sure we are answering knowing the period when an event would have taken place, because there's guidance on what to do when an event takes place between the year end and the signing of the report, between the date of the signing of the report and the issue of the report and subsequent to that. Very important to ensure that you get your dates right. You can do a number line and show where, so that you know where you are. Going concern is an issue also. There's a standard there, it's a number 570. I think there's an accounting standard. Is it accounting standard number 1, which requires management to assess the ability of the company as a going concern? It is management's responsibility to do that assessment for a period of not less than 12 months from the end of the year. The auditor's responsibility is to evaluate management's assessment and to ensure or confirm that actually management assessment is based on a 12-month period. If management assessment is for a period less than 12 months, then the auditor should request management to extend the evaluation. Are we together? So the primary responsibility, colleagues, lies with management to assess the going concern ability of the company. All the auditors will do review what management's assessment is, what are the assumptions that they used, are the assumptions reasonable? And of course, as the audit is going on, the auditors would want to be alert and look out for any evidence of the fact that there are going concern issues. They need to look out for any going concern issues that may exist in a particular company, because going concern determines the basis of the preparation of the financial statements. So they should look out for any going concern indicators. Okay, and then of course at the review stage also, the auditors will need to consider the uncorrected misstatements, and there's a standard there, ISA 450, which gives guidelines, which means as the audit is progressing, the auditors may come across misstatements, and most of them will request management to correct those misstatements. And there could still be some uncorrected misstatements at the end of the audit, and so the auditors would want to evaluate the extent of these uncorrected misstatements. And depending on how material they are, considering the materiality levels that would have been set earlier, the auditors may request that management should actually make a correction of those misstatements. Are we together, colleagues? And if management declines, depending on the materiality, the auditors may modify the auditor's opinion. Are we together? In terms of auditing standards, for reporting, the main standards are ISA 700, 701, and 705. Of course, there's 706 as well, which we are going to look at, I think, in the next slide. ISA 700 is the standard unmodified auditor's report, the one which has got the elements which, colleagues, you are supposed to know how they fall. It's a unmodified report and opinion is the one that is covered by ISA 700. Then you have to know the elements of the report. The elements simply means the paragraphs that go in there, and you must know them in the order in which they are. For example, the report has an addressee, the report has got an introduction, and then the next paragraph is the opinion paragraph. Then the basis for opinion, the key audit matters, you must know them in that order. Because if they are in any other order, then that is contrary to the provisions of this standard 700. And audit firms actually do follow this standard. They are not allowed to vary and start preparing reports the way they feel. They have to follow the standard guidelines. Are we together? So the basis for opinion comes after the opinion paragraph. And then other information paragraph also, where the auditors are able to explain the importance of other information and the responsibilities for other information. That is ISA 700. ISA 701 is on key audit matters. During the audit, the conduct of the audit, the auditors may have come across challenges or problems in conducting the audit, and they will have communicated a number of matters to those charged with the governance. And so the auditors need to determine whether there are any key audit matters which they feel they want to bring to the attention of users of financial statements. And what happens in this case, colleagues, is that when the auditors come across any problems, they will discuss with management and iron out with management. So these matters will be resolved. These matters will be contained in the financial statements, but the auditors need to or require to report these, include them in the auditor's report. These can only be included in a paragraph that was introduced for that purpose, which is the key audit matters paragraph. A few things about this paragraph. For listed companies, those whose shares are sold on the stock exchange, it's a requirement that the auditors include a key audit matters paragraph, even when they do not have any matters to report on. I'll repeat that, colleagues. For listed companies, it's a requirement, it's mandatory that the paragraph is introduced. It's part of the standard and modified report. That paragraph is there where the auditors will explain what it is meant for, and then they will state that we do not have any key audit matters to report on. So to suggest that there should be no paragraph or key audit matters paragraph simply because there are no matters to report in would be wrong. It has to be there. But for non-listed companies, it's optional whether to include the key audit matters paragraph. And when they decide to include the key audit matters paragraph, then they must comply with the provisions of the auditing standards. Are we together? So these are matters, they're extracted from matters communicated to those charged with the governance, which happen throughout the audit according to ISA 2.3&DA11. Are we together? Then the issues that will be in the key audit matters paragraph is why the matter is considered significant and how it was addressed. So there's really no problem. And these key audit matters, there are no separate opinions. There's always only one opinion. Are we together? We must be aware that there's some overlap between the key audit matters paragraph and the emphasis of matter paragraph, because both of them deal with matters that are contained in the financial statements. But the guidance is that the key audit matters paragraph the emphasis of matter must include matters that are fundamental to the audit. So the auditors have to decide, where do we put a matter, in the key audit matters paragraph or in the other emphasis of matter paragraph? What will determine is the extent of the matter of concern. If it is fundamental to the understanding of the financial statements, it must be in the emphasis of matter paragraph. If not fundamental but significant, then it will be included in the key audit matters paragraph. You cannot have the same matter included in both the key audit matters paragraph and the emphasis of matter paragraph. Very important, colleagues. 705, modification to the opinion according to the standard that was revised. Very, very important. We must know the provisions of this standard and be able to decide what form of opinion should be issued and to be able to critique an opinion that has been issued using the information that we learn from this standard. There are basically three forms of modification of the opinion. Why would auditors want to modify an opinion? It means they've got a matter of concern. That's the first thing. It means the auditors have got a matter of concern that prohibits them from issuing an unmodified opinion, stops them from saying the accounts show a true and fair view. So they've got a matter of concern. But then the standard gives three possible forms of modification, namely a qualified opinion, not an except for opinion. It's known as a qualified opinion, an adverse opinion, or a disclaimer of opinion. Now, the challenge is, how do auditors decide which one of these three to issue? Because you can't issue all three. You have to choose one opinion. Basically, there are two layers of decision-making, and I think we'll see them in the next slide. You have to look at whether or not sufficient appropriate evidence has been obtained. So read the question carefully. Is the examiner saying they've obtained sufficient appropriate evidence? That's one situation. The second situation is where there's a limitation of scope and the auditors have been unable to obtain sufficient evidence. There are two situations. So once you decide there is a matter, then you decide on whether or not you have obtained all the evidence you require or there was a limitation of scope. And then you ask yourself, is the matter of concern material? If the matter of concern is not material, colleagues, then it's end of story. The auditors will issue an unmodified opinion. It means that matter is immaterial, it's irrelevant in terms of forming the opinion, if it's not material. The issue comes up when the matter of concern is material. Maybe it's the extent of uncorrected misstatements, and we feel the amounts involved are material. Okay? Then we have to consider whether or not the matter is pervasive. Those are the two tests subjected to materiality and pervasiveness. Pervasiveness is basically what impact does it have on the financial statements? Is it restricted to one area or it impacts all the financial statements? How would it impact decisions made by users? The good news is, even if you don't know the meaning of pervasiveness, if you use it correctly, you get your marks. So you are saying, is this matter material? Is it pervasive? There are two possible answers. It could be material and not pervasive. So why that combination of material, not pervasive, then the auditors will issue a qualified opinion. They will say, except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. If the matter is both material and pervasive, then the auditors will issue an adverse opinion. Very, very important to know how to go around that matrix. Are we together? If there is a limitation of scope where the auditors have not obtained sufficient appropriate evidence, and there's a matter of concern, again, the auditors will ask themselves, is the matter of concern material? If it is not material, end of story, doesn't impact adversely the opinion. But if it is material, then you subject it to, is it also pervasive? And the answer could either be yes or no. So if it is material and not pervasive, again, the auditors will issue a qualified opinion where there's a limitation of scope and conclude that except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. But if the matter is both material and pervasive, then the auditors will issue an adverse opinion. And this is how we are supposed to navigate when given information in a scenario. Very simple information. Now, unless you know that, you are not likely to give the right advice. You are not even likely to know whether or not there is a wrong opinion that is being suggested. Are we together? There is also ISA 706, which discusses two paragraphs in the auditor's report, namely the emphasis of matter paragraph and the other matter paragraph. And I want to say here that we should know or be able to tell the difference between a modified report and a modified opinion. There are two different things. An unmodified report is the one that is like in ISA 700, and an unmodified report does not contain an emphasis of matter and an other matter paragraph. Those two paragraphs are not part of the elements of ISA 700. The moment they are introduced, and they can be introduced in an auditor's report, then the report becomes a modified report, not the opinion. It becomes a modified report. So what makes a report become a modified report is the inclusion of an emphasis of matter or an other matter paragraph, colleagues. Are we together? Okay? It's different from an unmodified and modified opinion. There are two different things. So the emphasis of matter paragraph is used for matters that are contained in the financial statements, and the auditor feels they are fundamental to users' understanding. They are fundamental for the understanding of the users of the financial statements. And these matters are in the financial statements. These matters have been correctly accounted for. These matters have been correctly disclosed in the financial statements, in the notes to the financial statements. If the auditor wants to emphasize like the name is suggesting, emphasis. If he wants to emphasize, then he can do that emphasis in the emphasis of matter paragraph. Are we together? Referring to the notes in the financial statements and basically repeating what is stated therein. The other matter paragraph is for matters that don't need to be in the financial statements, and the auditors feel they need to mention these matters, such as when the previous year financial statements were audited by different auditors. The auditors may want to mention this in the other matter paragraph. So we should know what should go where. Very, very important. There is some overlap between the emphasis of matter and the key audit matters paragraph, because both of them, like we said earlier on, deal with matters in the financial statements, and the auditor has to make a decision where to put matters. Okay, I'm trying to track my time. Will speed up a little bit. I want to give you at least not less than 30 minutes of discussions. Okay, then we've got another important standard, colleagues. All these were not in the terms of reference, but we need to understand they are critical. Other information, what is meant by other information? Other information in a document containing the financial statements is any other information other than the profit or loss account or comprehensive income, whatever it's called, other than the statement of financial position, other than the changes in income, cash flows, and other than the notes. The financial statements basically are the profit or loss, statement of financial position, and the related notes. Anything else is considered as other information. And this includes the director's report. It includes the chairman's report. It includes any ratios that the company may want to accompany the financial statements. That's all other information. Now, the responsibility for other information lies with management. Management should ensure that the other information is consistent with the financial statements. The role of the auditor is basically to read through the other information. The standard requires that the auditors should read through the other information and confirm or obtain evidence that there are no inconsistencies between the other information and the evidence that they've gathered. If there are any inconsistencies, the auditors would request management to correct and to the other information. Are you together, colleagues? So really the objective of the auditor is read the other information, compare and see if the other information contains contradictory information compared to the knowledge of the entity and also compared to the evidence that is gathered. Are we together? So in that paragraph, the auditors will simply explain what the meaning of other information is, the responsibility for other information, and if they have nothing to comment on, they will say we have nothing to comment on in case of other information. If there are some inconsistencies, then these would need to be explained in this paragraph. Very, very important. Okay, the last standard is ISA 265, which deals with the management letter. Basically, it's a byproduct of the audit. As the auditors are conducting an audit, they will come across internal control weaknesses that may exist in a company. And so they will record these. And then at the end of the audit, they will write a letter to management explaining what these weaknesses are so that management can put in place measures to correct these weaknesses. That doesn't take away the responsibility for internal controls from management. It's just that as they are conducting the audit, they identify specific weaknesses and they communicate these. And basically, what they will do, they will go under cover of a letter which will specify that actually these are not the only weaknesses that may exist. These came to the attention of the auditors in the process of conducting an audit, and that the letter is only for use by management and not any other third party. That should be in the letter. And then for each weakness identified, the auditors will explain the weakness in the first paragraph, then the implication of the weakness, the impact on the weakness on the company, and then the recommendation on how to remedy the weakness. And they will give an opportunity to management to respond, and then the auditor's response will also be in the report. So let's be aware of what is contained in a management letter, and let's be able to differentiate a management letter from an audit report there, because there are two separate things. Management letter is basically arising from the audit way. Quickly, we'll look at internal controls. Internal controls are important. These are management's responsibility. The objective basically for the auditors is to obtain evidence whether or not the controls are operating effectively, and therefore, after obtaining that evidence, decide on whether to follow a combined approach and rely on the controls or a strictly substantive audit approach method. And what we need to know about the controls is basically what is meant by controls, what is the control objective or the reason for the control, and the test of control. These are the main things that are examined on controls in the examination. Identify the control weaknesses, maybe make recommendations to improve those controls, or suggest a control activity and explain the control objective, the reason for the control, and also suggest a suitable test of control. Okay, so the policies and procedures are put in place by management so that the entity can achieve its objectives, and management is responsible for designing and maintaining the internal controls. And this they must acknowledge in the preconditions for an audit. The auditor is responsible for understanding and evaluating, not operating the controls. It's not the auditor's responsibility to operate. Effectiveness of controls determines the extent of further substantive procedures. If they are operating well, then the auditors will reduce. If they are not operating well, they will do more audit work. We should know the business systems that exist and the common documentation in each of these systems. The inventory system and goods received notes, purchase orders, and so on. Key controls, segregation of duties between stores, purchasing accounts, inventory count procedures, and so on. We must know those. Purchasing system, purchase requisitions, and the purchase orders, delivery notes. We must know those. Those are things that we're able to identify where they should fit in and where they're not actually operating. We should know the sales system, credit notes, dispatch notes, credit notes, and also age, the analysis of receivables, and also authorization of giving credit terms to receivables by a senior person. We must know those. The payroll and the clock cards where they're still in use, timesheets, we must know those, and the controls that should go. Okay, capital and revenue expenditure, whatever controls are there to ensure that costs are correctly classified between capital and revenue expenditure. And then, of course, the controls to do with cash and bank, including random cash checks, including bank reconciliations, and so on. All those are controls that must exist. We must know the controls on the petty cash, and so on. Are we together, colleagues? So we must have an idea of these systems in the real world. Very, very important. The components of internal control have been examined, where students have been required to explain the 5 components of internal control. Basically, the control environment, risk assessment, information systems, and control activities, and monitoring of controls. The auditors should have an understanding of these control activities as they assess the internal controls of an entity. And then, of course, we must know the methods that auditors use to record the accounting and control systems of a client company, and the advantages and disadvantages of each of these, including narrative notes. Auditors can record the system using narrative notes, flow charts, ICQs and ICEQs. We should be able to explain how these methods are used. Questions have been asked to explain maybe advantages of ICQ or disadvantage of ICEQs, or just to explain, other than narrative notes, which other methods can auditors use to record the accounting system. We should be able to do that. Common mistakes on controls, what the examination may require you. The question requirements could be explain internal control weaknesses and suggest suitable improvements. If you look at the past exam questions, that's how they come. And so presentation here would be important. One column, you explain the control weakness, then this improvement, suggest suitable internal control activities using the scenario information, explain the control objective. So you suggest suitable controls and explain the control objective. Explain the test of control for a given internal control, which means for you to be able to suggest a test of control, there must be a control activity in mind. Using scenario, suggest internal control activities as one, explain the control objectives of each, and explain the test of control. This can be answered in columnar form. It saves a lot of time, and you see a slide later on which explains that. Explain the objectives of test of control and the impact on audit procedures. Explain information to be contained in a letter of weakness or a letter to management. Explain the limitations of internal controls in a client company. Very, very important in terms of what the exam requirements are. In terms of common mistakes, failing to suggest suitable internal control activities, which shows lack of knowledge of the business systems. Failing to explain the control objective, why the control is there in the first place, or in fact, explaining management responses instead of tests of control. When you are required to explain the tests of control, usually students start explaining what the management response should be to a weakness. That is not correct. Tests of controls are from the point of view of the auditor. Poor presentation is also an issue here, or lack of understanding how the results of internal controls, sorry about that, affect the substantive procedures. Okay, substantive procedures designing and describing procedure must directly examine the skill. This is one of the most important topics, which is actually performed not very well by students. So we should know the meaning of substantive tests. The aim is to look out or test for misstatements in the figures in the financial statements. And the objective is to detect, yes, material misstatements. And we need to know the accounting for these items for us to be able to identify the risks and design suitable procedures. In designing audit procedures, colleagues, you need to have an assertion in mind. Those things we talk about cut-off, those things we talk about existence, completeness, and so on, you have to have them in mind. Then you'll be able to give a suitable substantive procedure. Then describing procedures, in other words, use the method the methods that are available to auditors and describe the procedure, okay, such as inspection, recalculation, and so on. And then audit risks for specific figures. You must be able to explain what could go wrong in the financial statements regarding inventory, what could go wrong in the financial statements regarding provisions, and so on. Are we together? Most mistakes, I think you can see these. The question examination requirements for procedures could be explained. Audit procedures for given financial statement figures, assertions. You are given financial statement assertions, then they say, can you explain the audit procedures? Explain the audit work expected to be found on tangible non-current assets in a review. Maybe you are the audit manager and you are reviewing the work of the audit senior. You are come to the area of tangible non-current assets. Explain the audit work you expect to have been done. Explain the meaning of financial statement assertions. So that gives you an idea of how questions would come. The common mistakes are put on the next on 17.8 there. Explaining procedures for assertions not required by the question. If the question says, give us a procedure for existence, then you give a procedure for rights and obligation. That is wrong. Look at the assertion. Stating financial statement assertions in procedure descriptions when not required. We're going together. If you are not required to explain or stating the assertion, you just explain the procedure without stating what assertion, because they want to give you marks. Explaining methods of obtaining evidence, very common error. Explain substantive procedures, you start explaining what recalculation is, third-party confirmation. You need to use those to describe the audit procedures. Not attempting to describe substantive procedures at all, leaving parts of questions blank. Simply stating a method name instead of explaining the procedure. Okay, suggesting written representations, where for everything, just say written representations. Not very good strategy. Okay, scenario-based questions and risk identification. All we are trying to give you or explain here is how to deal with the scenario-based questions. The fundamental rule is that they contain the information needed to answer the question. It is not possible to ask you questions on a scenario when the information is not there. So read the requirements first. Know what you are required to do. Read the scenario with professional skepticism. Be critical, and then you'll be able to identify the question requirements that you need. Okay, and then use specific names. Use the information in the scenario. Address all parts of multi-requirement questions. Where a question says, do this and do this, your answer should also be clear. I've done this and I've done the other part. Let the marks on offer obviously guide your depth, and leave a space between points. Presentation is important. Leave spaces between points. You can read the common scenario requirements as given here. Identify and explain audit risks. I think we are familiar with those. Are we together? Common mistakes, again, on the scenario-based questions, risk-based questions. It says, may ask for business risks only, audit risks, or both. And students answering the one that is not asked for. Business risk and audit risk, the comparison. We should ensure we answer the correct one. You give less than the required number. Maybe the question says identify 6 business risks, you identify 3. Then you get half the marks. Are we together? Then audit risks are those that have an impact on the financial statements. Are we together? And apply the appropriate knowledge of accounting when deciding on what risk it is. And then, of course, when you're required, you should explain the response of the auditors, not management, the response of the auditors to address the risk identified. Need to use professional skepticism here. You are able to actually get this. At the bottom there, we've indicated the common mistakes that students made make in answering this kind of question, and we have already mentioned them in passing. You can read through them when the slides are shared and so on. The next slide basically is giving you an illustration of a risky question. You can go through that again and look at the presentation. It says required, explain the audit risks and suggest responses. And you can see the paper has been divided into two. So you've got audit risks in the first column and then audit responses side by side. That is the best presentation. If that's the best presentation that you are supposed to use. Are we together, colleagues? Ethics and ethical questions. Again, another important area. Okay, I think we're almost 2 hours in another 2-3 minutes, which means we still have some 30-40 minutes. Ethics and ethical questions. Very fundamental topic for our profession. We should know the 5 ethical principles. If we use the mnemonic IPOC, okay, IPOC, you can see IPPOC, integrity, professional competence, professional behavior, objectivity, and confidentiality. We should know what the meaning of each one of these is, and we've tried to explain briefly in the notes there. We are together, and be able to identify where we are, where the auditor's objectivity is threatened by any of these. Then we should know the 5 ethical threats, namely self-interest threat, self-review, advocacy, intimidation, and familiarity. And know the examples of each one of these. Those with the arrows in your study manual. You should know why overdue fees cause a self-interest threat and what the auditor should do to remove that threat, that ethical threat. And when answering questions, let's not struggle to classify risks, ethical threats into self-interest, self-review, and so on. Go and just talk about the actual threat there. You can then conclude and say it gives rise to an ethical threat and so on. Are we together? We are giving in that slide the requirements that you may face in the exam and also the common mistakes. And there's an illustration there on an ethical question. You may want to go through it at your own time, isn't it? We've given the ethical matters. And again, look at the presentation with the related appropriate safeguards next to each other. You are making it easy for the examiner to give you to our due marks. So he looks at the ethical issue and you've explained side by side the appropriate safeguard and so on. Are you together, colleagues? Okay. Audit reports, review and report questions. Basically, we should know about comparative information, other information, subsequent events, and critiquing a suggested opinion and suggesting a suitable opinion, and in the forms of opinion which we've talked about, and the report elements and paragraphs. In other words, what are the elements and in what order do they come? And here we're just giving you a method that you can use to decide on the opinion. Very good presentation here, which says, if you have obtained sufficient appropriate evidence, the question, no matter identified, if there is no matter identified, then unmodified opinion. If there is a matter and it's material not pervasive, qualified opinion. Material and pervasive, adverse opinion. If there's a limitation of scope and it's material not pervasive, then it's a qualified opinion. But if it's material and pervasive, it's a disclaimer of opinion. And we give below the form of questioning that you may expect. And again, I urge you to read through and see so that you know what to expect and so on. Let's quickly look at the common causes of examination failure. What are the main causes of students failing? Again, please do note that this information is based on evidence that is there. So it's not just coming from a theoretical point of view. Attempting less than 4 questions, we've talked about it. And attempted parts of questions. And these are significant omissions that we see. Not using scenario information, not addressing the requirement, missing multi-part requirements where and is used. The question says, do this and do this. Marks are awarded for both requirements, and clear lack of knowledge where students clearly show that they don't understand certain matters. No reference to auditing standards, weak accounting knowledge, poor handwriting, wrong numbering, writing in margins. We talked about that. Overwriting. For 2 marks, you write a whole page. It's a waste of time. Everything about a topic, you just write anything you know about auditing. It doesn't work. You read the question requirement. Inadequate preparation, there's evidence of inadequate preparation. You cannot, these auditing papers require actually not less than 4 to 6 months of proper tuition for you to reach the competency levels required. But if you are going to try and do it in 1 month, it's very unlikely. Poor answer presentation, incorrect solution numbering, new questions on the same page, question box errors, we've talked about all those. Are we together? The next slide just gives you the best presentation. Again, please find time when this is shared to Go through and see how you present. I want to comment on format number 2, where for the same question, it requires you to identify risks and the responses. Columnar form, very straightforward. When you use format number 2, where you say part A, audit risks, then part B, audit responses, then the order, the number 1 on audit risk must be the number 1 on the audit response. And the number 2, like that. Order in B must mirror order in A. Are we together? In most cases, that is not the case. So be very, very careful. If you're not sure, use the other the columnar format and so on. Let's quickly run through the examination techniques that we might want to follow and which can help us enhance our chances of passing the exam. Time management, question selection, and in-room discipline, they are very, very important. There are 12 days to go before the exam. 12 days is a lot. You can actually go through the study manual in 12 days. So the key issues here is to deal with time. Time is a very critical factor. You have got 15 minutes reading time, use it carefully. For CA2.3, the compulsory question must be done in 72 minutes and no more. Sorry about that. 72 minutes and no more. And the optional questions must be done in 36 minutes each. If you overrun in one question, be assured you may not be able to attempt adequately one of the optional questions. The DA11 is 45 minutes in each of the questions that you are attempting and so on. So the main issues is time management, use reading time productively. And so that at least for the compulsory question, you have got a good clue. My advice is immediately you get the question paper, look at the requirements. It will bring your BP down because you will know that now this is what I'm expecting and so on. Attempt the required number of questions, attempt all parts of questions, use the scenario information. You can read the narrations on your own. Quality over quantity. It's not the amount of writing that will earn you marks. It's the marks, quality. Brief but clear. Cover the whole syllabus in preparing studies. And then mind your own business in the exam. Do not be distracted by other candidates who are asking for the third writing pad and so on. Number the solutions clearly. Use short headings by all means. It makes the work of the marker easier so that they don't have any excuse for not awarding you marks. And don't copy the question. It was common in the last exam, a lot of students literally copying the whole question again. What a waste of time. You have no time to do that. Just give a brief advantages of this. Don't start copying the question. Go for the easy marks and fight to the end. And 50 marks, you can be wrong and still pass the exam. 13 days is enough. Are we all together? Structured preparation can make a difference between now and the time we're writing the exam. Do not panic. Not in preparation, not in the examination room. Panic costs marks. Don't fear. Don't we know very well that there will be questions that you can't deal with competently. But if they're part of the 50 which you can get wrong, so let's not fear. 12 days, that is what stands between today and June 11th. From tomorrow is 12 days. Read 3 past questions and model answers every single day. Attempt one examination standard question under timed condition. Try a compulsory question in 72 minutes and see whether you can manage. Review your weakest syllabus areas each morning before anything else and complete one full mock exam, if you can, under exam conditions. That will really help you, colleagues. It has been a long session. I hope you were listening. I hope you are taking down your concerns so that now we can go into the session of questions, answers, and then contributions. I suggest that I can take maybe 2 questions at a time. Then you allow me to address those questions. Then we can take another set of questions. So we are really not far out. We still have about 30 minutes, and I hope it is sufficient. Feel free to contribute. Feel free to ask questions. This is an opportunity that you have. Keeping it will not help you. Just ask. Even what you might think is a silly question, just ask. It may make a difference between passing and failing the examination. I thank you. So it's basically question time now, colleagues.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Mumburuma. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I followed what you were talking about. First of all, it's the issue of maybe what I didn't know very well, it's the issue of the compulsory questions, which you said normally people have to deal with the compulsory questions, first of all, because they require them to answer from the from the scenario or the case study you provided. I think on my part, actually, it's one part that I have greatly appreciated. Then I think the second part that I would seek clarification from you is the part where you are talking about substantive procedures. Substantive procedures where we say that you said that people have to check the figures to ensure that the figures are not misstated. And then I think you raised two major objectives actually pertaining to substantive procedures. Maybe that would be what I can say is my first comment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Second one, then I will deal with that. Thank you. Any other question? Okay, while we are still thinking, maybe let me comment. In terms of the compulsory question, you see the way this exam is, you are not guided as to which question to start with in answering the examination. You can actually start with the optional question. You can even answer the compulsory question last. But that's why we are trying to help you and follow a proper procedure, so to say. Imagine the compulsory question in 2.3 carries 40 marks. 40% of the marks are in the compulsory question. It carries the highest number of marks. In my view, that is a question that I would want to pay attention to when I'm still fresh and energetic. Because as the exam goes, you will really lose the stamina and you get stressed up and so on. Are we together? And like I've already said, the evidence is there that most students who pass actually do well in the compulsory question. It's very unlikely. Some students pass by even when they get maybe 14, maybe 17 out of the 40 marks. But imagine you have to get the rest of the marks from the 3 optional questions where we have said, and you can look at the examiner's reports for the past to find that the average scores on the optional questions is very low. People get 5 out of 20. People get 4 out of 20. People get 7. The average could be 7 out of 20. And don't be scared by that. It's just the lack of preparedness. So that's why I would, if I were the one writing the exam, I would deal with the compulsory question, but deal with it within the 72 minutes. The moment 72 minutes is up, then I move on to another question. Are you together? In terms of substantive procedures, the issue is auditors are supposed to carry out substantive procedures on all material items in the financial statements. And the idea is that's the actual auditing action, where you're trying to obtain evidence on whether the figures in the financial statements are materially misstated. Remember, the objective of the auditor is to obtain sufficient evidence to form an opinion on whether or not the financial statements are materially misstated. So you are just saying, look, could these things be wrong? And so in doing so, the key issue for the auditor is to know the financial statement assertions. If you don't understand financial statement assertions, it's unlikely that you'll be able to perform audit procedures. I tell students there are audit plans or audit procedures in the study manual. You cannot read it. I don't think anyone can memorize those audit procedures. So what you need is to understand the concept and the principles and then be able to apply them. Are we together? For example, if you're auditing inventory, for example, you will have to identify what assertions do I want to test. One of the assertions is valuation, because management is making a claim that inventory has been correctly valued at the law of cost and net realizable value. That is one of the tests that I will do. So how do I do that? For a sample of items, I will check the valuation by management for correctness. I will request to know what the net realizable value is. I will request to know what the cost is and determine the lower one, and that should be the one that is used for valuation of the inventory. If you are testing for existence of inventory, for example, the appropriate procedure will be physically inspect the inventory, attend the inventory count. If it's motor vehicles, you want to test for existence, because the claim or the assertion is that the motor vehicles represented by the figures in the financial statements actually exist. Because if they don't exist, then they shouldn't be in the financial statements. The financial statements will be misstated. So to test for existence, request management to present to you, the auditors, bring those vehicles whose numbers we are finding in the financial statements and physically check. Are we together? And actually, you need to check whether the engine numbers are correct. They'll bring you a vehicle that is for someone else. So we want to check the white books for rights and ownership, meaning the company owns these vehicles. For the actual existence, you want to check, is the engine, is the chassis correct? The chassis number, because they can bring you any other vehicle and change the number plate. Then you say it exists when it doesn't exist because of the risks of fraud. Are we together, my colleague? Okay.
Say the last one that I want to ask is, when you are talking about internal controls,
Yes.
you said there are 5, is it 5 stages of controls where you started with risk assessment, then
Yeah.
what are the other 4? You said risk assessment.
Those are components of internal control. Okay, the risk assessment, the control activities themselves, the risk, the way the company identifies risks. You will check them on the slide. There are 5 components of internal control. Are we together? And they have actually been examined to say, look, what are these? Monitoring of control is another one. Meaning the entity, the management, are supposed to do those, but the auditors need to gain an understanding of what controls exist, how the company manages controls, how they monitor that the controls are operating, and the actual control activities themselves. So the auditors need to know the elements of internal control. Are we together? They are basically a given. They are more or less like the 5 fundamental principles. They are given, it's those 5. So even these, if you're not sure, go back and look at them. You can go to the slide that is relevant to that. You'll find that they are fairly straightforward. All we need is to know them, and also why the auditors, in gaining an understanding, the auditors need to know those, how management manages those elements or components of internal control. I'm trying to go back. Okay. Any other question, even as I flip back to see if we can. Okay, here we are. Components of internal control. It's basically the control environment. The auditors need to understand the control environment and make an assessment of the control environment in an entity. After performing, after gaining an understanding, you can actually conclude and say, here in this company, the control environment is poor. Maybe you are seeing people taking goods out at the gate, they don't even check them. You are able to observe. So you need to understand the control environment, which should be championed from the top management, actually. You need to understand as auditors the risk assessment processes that are used by the entity, because management is responsible for assessing risks. Because when they assess risks, if the risk assessment processes are good, it means then they will put in place controls to manage those risks. But if there are poor risk assessment processes, then it means the risk that misstatements could go undetected is high. Are we together? We need to know the information system that the entity is using, the accounting package they are using, and so on. And the actual control activities. What are the controls in this particular entity? We need to gain an understanding of that. And also the monitoring of control. Do they have an internal audit department which checks control? The controls is a matter of monitoring. Are we together? Because at the end of it all, the auditor has to decide whether or not to rely on the controls. Are we together? Of course, they will then need to perform tests of controls. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yes.
No.
Anyone else?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, thanks.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Hello?
Okay, so
yes.
am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so there are 2 forms of engagements that an auditor can enter into. So just wanted to know if that is also part of the syllabus that will be examined in. And also there are audit engagements and other engagements that are not connected to the financial reports. Are those engagements, can you just briefly explain and also tell us if they are also part of the syllabus that is being examined?
Okay. Maybe tell me, I got the last one. What was the first one again? Sorry about that. What was the
first one is the 2 forms of engagements that an audit firm or practitioner can be engaged to do. So yeah, so those are the ones that I want to know briefly, and also if those are also part of our syllabus.
Okay. There are 2 types of engagements, either reasonable assurance engagement or limited assurance engagements. Auditors can get into any of those, you see. And reasonable assurance engagements is where the assurance is a high level, it's a high level of assurance, and auditors perform a significant amount of audit work, you see, such as an audit of financial statements is a reasonable assurance engagement. Whereas a review is an example of a limited assurance engagement, where the audit risk is higher than in a reasonable assurance. In other words, in this case, the client may be comfortable with a review rather than an audit. And in a review, the auditors mainly use inquiries of management and analytical procedures, that's all. And so, and the report or the conclusion is in a negative form, where the auditors say we have no reason, we have not seen anything that causes us to believe that the accounts do not show a true and fair view. Whereas in a reasonable assurance, which is a high level of assurance, the auditors will expressly state that the accounts do or do not show a true and fair view, you see. Are we together? And then the last one, you said other assurance engagements. Other assurance engagements, you can actually check that in the syllabus, in the sense that they are not in the syllabus. Basically, they are in the advisory level. You are talking about things like due diligence. You're talking about review of financial statements. You are talking about the actual details of the review of financial statements. You are talking about reviews of interim financial statements and so on. Those are not in the syllabus. But that is something that you can actually yourselves check and confirm. Look at the syllabus. To remember, my first few slides were about the syllabus. We should know what we are supposed to do and just do what is within the syllabus. Okay. Yes, any other?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mumburum. The session is very helpful.
Thank you.
I would just like to know, I've seen a number of questions where the examiner is asking us to redraft the report. So yes. I'm asking, are we supposed to memorize the actual language that is used in the standard report, or we can use any as long as it's in line?
Okay, that's a very good question. Yes, you are expected to put, and it's extracts of the report. It's usually not everything. And the extracts you have been asked to draft basically deal with either the opinion paragraph and the basis for opinion. Are you getting the point? In other words, maybe in the first part, the examiner might ask you to suggest a suitable opinion. Are you getting me? Let's say in part one, they say using the information, suggest a suitable opinion. And this will suggest considering the materiality and pervasiveness of the matter. And so if you conclude that the opinion, I suggest that we issue a qualified what? Opinion. Have you seen? So we said a qualified opinion should be issued. Then it says, can you draft the extracts of the report considering the opinion you have chosen? Then what you're expected to do is you should say, you just say extracts. The heading will be extracts of report. And the first one will be qualified opinion. He wants to see whether you know that when you issue a qualified opinion, the opinion paragraph changes from opinion to qualified opinion. Have you seen? So you say qualified opinion. And all you need to show is that you know the wording. You say, except for this matter, the account show a true and fair view. That's all. You don't need to memorize much and everything. Are you together? Then the basis for opinion changes to basis for what? For qualified opinion. Are you getting the point? So you are demonstrating that you know that when you modify an opinion, the name, the element in the unmodified report change to qualified opinion, basis for qualified opinion. The wording for a qualified opinion reads like, except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. If you can say that, I think that is satisfactory. And the basis for opinion is basically why you have arrived at that opinion briefly. If you need to include an emphasis of matter paragraph, then you include an emphasis of matter paragraph and show that you understand that this should make reference to the notes in the accounts. I think I've seen one question where they say note so-and-so says this. So in the emphasis of matter paragraph, you say note 5 of the financial statements talks about this, and you're just emphasizing, and that's all. The other way you could be asked the questions, they give you a draft report. Since you are saying maybe you don't want to draft a report, they give you, here's a report. And it has got wrong information. It says opinion paragraph, but the explanation for a qualified opinion. So you should be able to say no. Since it's a qualified opinion, the heading should change to qualified opinion, not opinion. The basis for opinion should change to basis for qualified opinion, and so on. Be able to critique. Remember, colleagues, and the interesting thing is the syllabus doesn't change. This syllabus has been running for 5 years now, I think from 2017. It doesn't change. So really, it's about the examiner this time will do this, will do that. And you see the benefits, my brother, of going through past questions and answers. Because if you went through, even now, you can start going through 3 questions per day. Read the questions and read the answers. Then you'll be able to know these things you're asking. I'm not saying you have done wrong to ask, but it will be obvious from the information that you get or the knowledge you get through reading past exam questions and answers. Anything else before I conclude and pass on to Zika?
Sorry, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, thanks.
I wanted you to share the slide for where there's the tree on the audit risks and audit responses.
You wanted, well, may I say, maybe let me explain. Maybe let me explain what audit risk and the response is, because that is just an example. Are you getting the point? The
yes,
issue
it is, but there's something I wanted to refer to.
Okay, just a second. Just a second. The big screen. Okay. Where are we? Okay. You are saying the slide on risk. Am I sharing?
There's a question that you shared for, I can remember tree.
Yes. Just a minute. Where is that?
Sorry to take you back.
No, don't worry. We were trying to get it. But if I could go, it would be fast.
In case you're unable to see it, I wanted to. Okay.
Go ahead. You wanted?
I wanted to know how to come up with the work that the auditor needs to do on the audit responses.
Okay. That's why I wanted to explain what is meant there. Remember, the stage where the audit is doing this risk assessment is the planning stage, isn't it? You are planning the audit. You are not really doing the actual audit the tests at this stage. Are you getting the point? So you are planning to conduct the audit. And all we are saying is you need to identify. Let us say you are talking about a manufacturing company for pharmaceuticals or medicines, isn't it? Are we together? Now, from your knowledge as auditors, you know that medicines can expire. Am I right? Medicines can actually expire. And therefore, expiry of medicines can result in the value, the net realizable value, to be low. So the risk I'm identifying is that management may actually value expired drugs at what? At cost, when they are not supposed to be valued at anything. Because when the medicines have expired, it means they are worth nothing. They have to be thrown away, even legally. So that is the risk. I've identified the risk. Now, how do I respond? Remember, we are planning the audit. So how we will respond is, we'll say that we'll attend the inventory count. Are you seeing that? We'll attend the inventory count and read the inventory count instructions to see whether the instructions are actually saying expired inventory must be identified and isolated. Have you seen what I've said? So I've identified the risk at the beginning. The risk is that the company may value expired inventory at cost when it shouldn't. I've identified the risk. How do I respond? We are planning the audit. We are at the planning stage. So I will respond by saying, guys, we will need to attend the inventory count and look out for how expired inventory has been isolated. Are you getting the point? And that works.
Yes, I am, sir.
Yes. Are you seeing? So in other words, by identifying the risk, it has reminded us that it has told us that we should be alert and look out that this thing may have caused the financial statements to be misstated, and therefore we attend the inventory count. If it's receivables, the edge analysis shows that a lot of receivables are outstanding beyond 90 days and so on. There's a risk that the provisions may be understated. That's the risk And it's just a risk. We're not saying they are understated. There's a risk that they will be understated. And so how do we respond? We are going to say, okay, since they are above, we would want to inquire from management how they determined the credit losses, how they determined the allowance for receivables. So specifically knowing that there was that risk, then of course we'll do other procedures like confirmation, third-party confirmation, and so on, you see. But the important thing, I think, from what I'm gathering from what you are asking, we should know that the response is the auditor's response, not management's response as such, but the auditor, how the auditor will respond to the risk that they've identified. Just like if you identify a risk at home that people who are not supposed to gain entry will gain entry. You have identified the risk. How do you respond? You are going to either put a grill door to prevent those people. That's the kind of reasoning that is there, you see. Are we together? And let's remember the point at which this risk assessment is being done. It's at the planning stage of the audit. It enables us to identify, so that we pay particular attention to these risk areas and perform certain procedures to confirm whether or not those risk areas have caused the financial statements to be misstated. Does that help?
It has. Thank you. It's unfortunate you can't share the question.
No, but the fortunate thing is all these slides.
No, I've understood.
Yes,
I've understood. Thank you.
If you notice towards the end, I was rushing because I wanted to give you time to ask, but the slides will be shared by Zika. I'm sure as soon as possible, they'll share all these slides, so you'll be able to go through and see. And if you have any questions specific, you can still communicate to me through whatever means, then I'll be able to assist you. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I think my point really, all I want to say is thank you for attending this session. I hope it has been worth it. And you will notice if you are seeing how many people have attended this meeting, there are less than 20. And I want to make a point. I know I'm talking to people who have attended. Do you see what happens? There are less than 20 people. The pass rates were very low. And most of the students who are going to sit this exam sat for the March exams. And the Institute has organized this to try and help them, but they are not in attendance. That is the challenge that is there. Because the question is, what else should the Institute do? Tell you what questions are coming in advance? No, it cannot work. The aim is to train accountants who will be able to work in the workplace and they add value to their clients and to their employers. So really, I want to thank you for attending. I hope you have benefited something, and I can only wish you well in the examinations. There's still 12 days to go. 12 days can and should make a difference on whether you pass the exam or not. Otherwise, once again, I thank you. I hand you over back to Mr. Katunga, I think, who is also listening in.
No, thank you so much, sir. You have done a great job here. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks for that compliment.
We'll be in touch with you. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mumbuluma, for the good presentation. Had we been in a hall, I would have asked colleagues to clap for you. But all the same, thank you so much. It is our hope that our students have walked away with a lot of lessons from your presentation, and that they will be able to apply what they have since learned as they start writing the exams. To the students, thank you so much for making time for this important meeting. We urge you to always make time for such meetings, so that as an institute, we know that what we are channeling our resources towards does impact you. So for those that were asking about the presentations, I wish to indicate that we shall share the presentation. Our intention is to ensure that you receive all presentations by close of business on Monday. Okay? We will make sure that you receive so that they are of help. Otherwise, thank you so much. Have a pleasant weekend, and all the best as you prepare for the forthcoming exams. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Gatungoso. Thank you. We greatly appreciate it.
All right, you are.